I was posting a link to one of my blogs in a comic book Facebook group, and one of these guys decided to say to me, "Don't you ever write anything positive about the comic book industry?" Well, I would love to write something positive about the comic book industry. Unfortunately, many of the publishers don't give me anything to work with. When it comes down to this comic book industry, it's pretty much a jumbled mess. And one of the big problems is that many of these comic publishers, including the corporate giants that like Warner Brothers DC Comics and Disney's Marvel Comics, is that they don't produce products that can be sold to customers outside of comic book readers. And it's primarily these days comic book fans making products for comic book fans, not comic book creators making products for casual readers. And that's one of the big problems with the whole comic book industry is that it's so insular that it cannot grow, and that everybody is focused on trying to please and appease regular comic fans, that they're not looking to expand their audience to a larger audience. And that's one of the big problems that's going on with it. The other big problem is that the comic book business is not run like a business. There is no business model attached to it, primarily, again, because we have comic book creators in management positions. Nobody is looking at this business objectively and taking a look at where this business is going to go in the next 5, 10, or 15 years, the way a seasoned executive with an MBA would take a look at a business like a comic book business and say, look, this is what direction we want to go in, this is where we want to go, this is the audience we want to target, this is the demographics we want to go to, and this is where we want to go and where we want to set a course for. No, that's not done. And we look at these whole storylines like your DC Comics Rebirth, there is no real long-term plan, to target larger audiences or audiences of new readers. Instead, because we have Jeff Johns, who is a comic book writer and not a businessman focused on the long-term plans, the entire industry is going to usually suffers because these guys just don't understand how things relate to things in the business world. Because they've been given a blank check by Warner Brothers, they really don't focus on how the approaches they're using are going to be profitable in the long term, or how they are going to relate to the short term. And because that's another big problem I saw with Marvel Comics and their recent diversity launch. It's just executed very, very poorly. They're saying that they want to bring diversity, but it's the way that they're executing the diversity that is going to do long-term damage to their brand. Because again, they're not running it like a business. They're just reacting and creating things just for the sake of creating it, not thinking about the ramifications of it or how the customer is going to relate to the product. All they're doing primarily is doing things to get quick press, which is short term, but then long term, when you're trying to launch something like a publication, you have to think when you do this, because you have to think about the 90-day window in between the announcement and then when the initial product hits the marketplace. Because that's something I have to do when I launch SJS Direct Titles, is I have to think about when I announce a product, how the customer is going to react to it, and then later on how the customer is going to respond when the product finally hits the marketplace. And when I look at recent initial launches, like when they announced Roxane Gay as the writer of this Black Panther miniseries, that was a poorly executed business plan, because they announced it like a black feminist was going to be writing for Marvel, and then they announced they hired their first black woman. That was a fumbled football, because what they should have just said is, we are going to launch a spin-off of this popular Black Panther series and put a period at the end of it, and then allow that to be the press release. But no, they decided to go and push a diversity initiative where there wasn't a diversity initiative needed. Same thing with this black female Iron Man that they pushed. They said Iron Man is going to be a black woman. Then later on, you have them retracting in a press release, trying to say, oh, she's going to be taking his place as a character named Ironheart. And when I look at that, I go, you dropped the football yet again, because now the customer is going to be looking at you going, which direction is this going in? I thought that this was what it was going to go, then you're going in another direction. And when I get to the product on the shelf, I'm going to become even more confused. And that's one of the big problems with the comic book business overall. Because they don't run it like a business, everything is jumbled, everything is directionless, everything is pretty much lost. Yes, a comic fan who has been reading comics since today will understand it, but the casual reader is going to come in and they're going to become lost. and confused. Because when I look at recent events like your Secret Wars with multiple versions and multiple storylines, it's a jumbled mess. And then I look at the books that came out afterwards, it's just so jumbled. And the same thing with DC's Rebirth. It's just so jumbled. And it's hard for a new customer who just got through watching Captain America Civil War and seeing everything literally laid out like the old school Marvel Universe to walk into a comic shop and come in and understand where everything is. Because when they come in to the comic shop, those few that do, because when in most cases a comic shop is very hard to find in many parts of the country because there aren't that many of them, they wind up coming lost and confused. Even when they go to the Barnes & Noble and try to find the comics or the trade paperbacks, they find themselves lost and confused because they not only have to deal with all these continuities, they have to deal with the whole idea of reboots. Because the only place in the publishing world where there are reboots are in the comic book business. And that really has been hurting the comic book business for the last 20 years because the new customer cannot come in and access the product. When it comes down to any other publication out here, you can pretty much walk in, pick up a copy, and start reading. When it comes down to comics, you literally have to go out here and go read Wikipedia before you pick up an initial issue of a comic. And that's very frustrating for a brand new customer, especially a young customer out here who has just got through watching one of these superhero movies and they want to see the further adventures of their character. They would rather go and watch an animated series or something else rather than deal with that morass in the publishing division. And again, that has to do with the publishing business not being run like a business. Because if the business were run like a business, it would have a structure, it would have a foundation, creative people would have a direction to go in, they would be able to set a course for the storylines that they're going on, and everything would be laid out in a way that is accessible to the reader. And that's the big problem with the whole comic book industry. They are not focusing on traditional customers. They are focusing on comic fans, and they make products for comic fans. And you can't expand a market in this business world expanding just going to comic fans. You have to expand outward once you have your core customer base. Once you have your core audience, you need to create products that expand to a larger audience if you hope to grow the marketplace. And that's the big problem with the comic book industry. Ever since it contracted in the 1990s, it has never made any sort of plans to grow. Yes, they make all sorts of gimmicks and shock marketing, but shock marketing works for comic fans. It makes an emotional response in them. It does not make an emotional response in casual readers. Casual readers pretty much do not care about that. What they want to know is, hey, I want to see an Iron Man that looks like Robert Downey Jr. in the movie. Or I want to see a Captain America that's kind of like Chris Evans from the movie. I want to come in and see them having fantastic adventures just like I saw in that movie. But when they get to the comic shop, the few that do go there, or the Barnes & Noble, they go there and they have to deal with comics that don't even look like the comics that they knew as a child or that what they saw in the movie. And that pretty much impedes comic book sales. That prevents the industry from growing overall. And a lot of people in the comic book business, again, they're so close to the product, they can't take that step back and look back at it objectively the way I did, because I study the business side of it. And I said, you know, you have to take a step back, because that's something I had to do with the SJS Direct imprint, and say, look, I can't get too close to the product. I can't get too emotionally attached to the product. I have to pull myself away so that I can look at the product objectively and how it relates to the customer, how the customer is perceiving the product, how the customer relates to the product, and how the customer is going to respond to the product. Because if the customer looks at the product and they're sitting there trying to figure out what direction things are going in, guess what? They're not going to buy that product. Because I've seen this happen many times when I go to places like Target or any place like a supermarket. If I have to try to figure out how to use a product and it's not easy to use or it's not easy to access, guess what? I'm not buying that product. And that's something I even heard, guys on Shark Tank say, that, look, if this product is not accessible, guess what? I'm not buying that product. It's just as simple as that. And many people in the comic book business just don't understand that. You have to have books that are easy to enter, easy entry points in every book, just like Jim Shooter said in his blog many years ago. Every book has to have an entry point. You cannot dictate the entry point to the reader. You have to have products that, are easy to recognize. And I don't see that in the comic book business right now. Every year or every reboot, somebody's got a new costume, and that's pretty much hard for anyone to follow. And these are all things that are impeding the growth of the comic book business because, again, many people in the comic book business are creating products for themselves, but not products for the customer. And because the customer is not getting the product they want, guess what they're doing? They're going out and buying other products and moving on. Or they're just moving on, period. And this is the sad part because when I think about the comic book business and what it was back in the 80s when it was run like a business and people were sitting there getting mad at people like Jim Shooter, pretty much he was running it like a business and they were getting the dividends and the returns on it because he was running it, Marvel Comics, like a business. And because people like Jeanette Kahn were running it like a business, they were pretty much getting the expanded audience, they were getting the increased readership. And then when products like Batman in 1989 was launched, you saw a big surge of people going out to buy Batman comics. And that was all because the comic book business was run like a business and they were ready and able to receive the customer when they had that surge from 89 from the Batman movie. They were able to have the product ready that was consistent, with the somewhat consistent with Tim Burton's movie, and people could recognize who Batman was. They could understand who he was. They understood it was a guy in a bat costume that was blue and gray, and that was similar to what they saw in Super Friends, and they could correlate everything together and understand it and figure it out, and then go to the comic shop or go to the newsstand or go to the grocery store and pick up that comic and understand where they wanted to go. But they can't do that these days because the entire everything is just so jumbled and everything is just so overdone that you're sitting there going, okay, this is Captain America of Earth A, or this is Superman of Earth 2, and nobody's going to sit there and not try to figure all this out. In a business situation, people want to get their products quick, they want to get it fast, and in this internet day and age of digital publication, people want to be able to access their products in like that. They want to be able to type in that word in Google search, or they want to be able to type that phrase into Amazon's search bar, and they want to be able to see that product pop up. And when it comes down to comics, we're not seeing anybody focusing on trying to develop products that would be this easy to access for customers all over the world in such an easy to follow fashion. And that's one of the reasons why your comic book business is pretty much struggling 25 years later and has not rebounded the way it should have. What the comic book business industry really needs to do is start taking a look at itself and start focusing on a direction where it's run like a business, not like a hobby for comic fans that create products for other comic fans. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.